Welcome to Speaking Concretely, the official podcast of the Cement Association of Canada. I'm your host, Adam Auer, President and CEO of the CAC. Today we're joined by Jonathan Westeinde, Chief Executive Officer of Windmill Developments. Jonathan is a recognized and celebrated leader in the developer space, known for some of the most ambitious and innovative sustainable development projects in the country. From Dockside Green in Victoria, British Columbia, to the Zivi development, where I'm recording from here in Ottawa, Ontario. Jonathan's approach has not only been to integrate sustainability into building practices, but to reimagine the whole development process and redefine how to deliver environmental and social value through construction. Jonathan has been recognized with numerous awards, most recently the Canada Green Building Council's Lifetime Achievement Honor. John, it's a pleasure to have you on Speaking Concretely. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So tell us a little bit about Windmill Developments. How did Windmill get started, and what's been the journey to get to where Windmill is today?
I'll give it the short version, but I mean, Windmill was started a little bit out of a couple of things, but my family had a large construction business here in town, and I'd worked in it when I was younger enough that I was like, I don't have anything to do with this business. It's a lot of friction, a lot of tension, very low in innovation, all those sorts of things. And then left that, got into more tech-related stuff and venture capital-related stuff, sort of that higher curve of innovation. And then, but always had an interest in sustainability and the right sort of business opportunities around driving sustainability. And there was a book I'd read during a transition period called Natural Capitalism by Amory Levins and Paul Hawkins. And this is one of those books, a lot of these books speaking about climate and stuff they just want to make you crawl into a hole. But this was really a book that's speaking about, where are the opportunities if you really focused on trying to drive sustainability in existing business practices. And there's a large section on real estate and just how that's one of the few industries that really has the opportunity to excel in performing better in having, really raising the sustainability bar, but doing it at a way that can drive, at the same time, better bottom line. So that was an element of it. And then it was also just the main driver in looking at sustainability into the built environment is, it is still the industry that's, one of the few that's not had its sort of tech revolution yet, and still is a laggard as far as one of the slowest in innovation, lowest R&D, all these sorts of things, right? But what sustainability really has done is it's been the driver, if you want to call it, for many things in advancing faster innovation in the built environment. And so it's really around both, looking at the opportunity to sort of differentiate and focus at a personal interest on sustainability, but also as a real driver to sort of advance and accelerate innovation in our approach. And it is an industry that, it's generally been one where it's the biggest balance sheet wins. So if you want to get in there and start doing like Dockside Green, for example, us landing that, we're up some pretty big heavyweights and we were a startup with no balance sheet, right? But by taking kind of that real sort of focused approach and putting the big vision out there and driving innovation, we were able to be awarded it, get the financial support surrounding us, all that sort of stuff. But it was sort of people getting aligned around us with that, high bar, that high vision we set around sustainability.
I really like this idea of sustainability as a driver of innovation, because I think it defines a lot about what's happening in the cement and concrete industry. And I'm going to get to that in a second, but I want to start with, sort of the evolution of your ambition at Windmill. A lot of your projects feature the Green Building Council's LEED certification program. But there's another system that has become pretty central to your work as well, known as the One Planet Living Sustainability Framework, and arguably even more ambitious than LEED. What is One Planet Living, and why is it so important to Windmill's work?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about our evolution of that. I mean, we from the standpoint of it's just the work we're doing and getting certification on third-party verification is at times why you're doing that. But I think it is important for validation verification, especially with a lot of greenwashing out there in the market and all this sort of stuff, that there is as third-party authentication to the claims you make and are achieving. And so I was on the founding board of the Canada Green Building Council when LEED came to Canada. That's sort of what created some of the initial connections for the success of Windmill going where it was. And at the time, that was really the only thing there was, to sort of say, okay, like we're setting a high ambition here. In that case, it was LEED Platinum, and we have the authentication approach through LEED. LEED as a rating system is good, but it's really just speaking to the building performance itself. And when you're looking at what you're doing as a developer, you're really trying to build community assets, and that community asset is far more than just as your building operating, at lower energy or zero carbon. It is about all the impacts you're making. If we think about the Zibi development here, for example, and we had Indigenous partnerships, we had community equity coming in, all these sorts of things. So the One Planet Living framework we came across through our advisory arm in a community called Sonoma Mountain Village outside of San Francisco, and really like that because it is sort of 10 pillars, of which it's all the things. It's like an overlay of LEED as it relates to the building specific performance things, but then it brings in a much broader community context. And so there's 10 pillars that are very tangible things like zero carbon, all the way to the very intangible of health and happiness, for example. How do you measure that? But and in between things like bringing in community equity into the project, or transportation related issues, that sort of stuff. So we just felt it was a much more holistic, broader context that at the time there wasn't necessarily as much a focus on social impact, but built the social impact into the system as well. But we see it as kind of an umbrella that works. So we still certify our buildings under the LEED system on the building performance side, but we wrap the performance metric of the projects we're doing through the whole kind of One Planet Living framework. It is it's governed by a nonprofit out of the UK called Bioregional. It's not that well known in North America. It's been adopted, more in Europe and other places around the world. But that's part of the reason we like it also, is it creates an ability for us to sort of differentiate again how we message our narrative. But fundamentally, it's just a good planning architecture to bring in everything related to the outside and inside elements of what you're creating within a community asset into your framework and story.
That's like a very non-linear kind of way of thinking about the sustainability value proposition.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that brings me back sort of that comment about sustainability and innovation, because, in our industry, cement and concrete industry, sustainability, and I would say climate change, obviously in particular, is really driving us to innovate, new value propositions on climate resilience, on reducing our emissions, on circular manufacturing and construction processes. And, we're also trying to smooth the pathway for the adoption of those innovations through, what we think is pretty radical transparency and disclosure efforts to support better decision making. But ironically, we find that the construction community is not actually ready for those innovations. And like one example would be just on embodied carbon, which is kind of one simple metric. The carbon associated with building materials and systems. It's definitely gaining traction with developers and architects, and we're even seeing the codes and standards system start to talk about it. But it still feels like super niche.
Yep.
But Windmill's taken like quite a strong position outside of the broader umbrella framework of One Planet Living. Like even on embodied carbon, it's pretty central to the thinking in your projects. Above and beyond energy efficiency and clean energy supply. Like the majority of builders are not doing this. Why are you guys doing it?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting, yeah. So we really started mapping out to, the zero carbon operationally great. But yes, we all appreciate the substantial impact of the embodied carbon and really trying to tackle how can we move cement, other materials, other things to drive to a much lower embodied carbon. And eventually it's about, how do you get to cradle to cradle type, building approach and systems. But I would say it's also, I mean, that's just a case of it's, again, sort of been our DNA to sort of always try and advance from a sustainability standpoint. There's not like a clear business metric that says that makes sense or why, other than that's just, again, our call it what we find to be our competitive advantage in dealing with our, how we secure our lands and other things, usually with clients or customers that are also caring about those same things. So it sort of creates a virtuous cycle for us. But I would say that, embodied carbon, zero carbon operationally, is something you could put some math to and sort of say, yeah, if I put some money here and I reduce my energy costs, and usually then there's a payback there, right? Embodied carbon really is not got a payback story to it, other than a feel good story to it. So that's one of those things that unless it either is put in a code, building code requirements, or there's a taxonomy that's put to it that sort of gives some incentive to sort of benefit from the point of view of looking at your embodied carbon, then there is, if the market's going to react to what they're being told. Unfortunately, I'm increasingly of a believer it's the stick, not the carrot, that are getting people to do things, and neither the carrot or the stick exist as it relates to embodied carbon. And further, I would say just the math to sort of the universal language of embodied carbon is still very discombobulated, right? And I know there's work being done on that, and there's the intent between steel, wood, and concrete, and all these sort of sort of say, okay, we're all measuring in the same way, but I think we know that is still got margins of interpretation. So it's still not something that you could sort of say is, even if there was such a market, tradable, in the sense of the verification of it.
Yeah, there's a few interesting things to pick at there, but maybe let's start with the business case piece. So we certainly encounter a very common perception, when we're promoting, what we would consider low hanging fruit solutions to lower carbon cement and concrete. The perception is that it's expensive. Buying lower carbon materials is going to inevitably lead to higher costs of construction. And of course, that's even a harder case to make now when affordability is such a major issue.
Yeah.
I know that for Windmill and for you personally, that innovating new forms of financing for one planet design and more sustainable construction is a passion. But how is the business case for sustainable construction evolving? I mean, you've been in it for decades now. Do you see movement in the right direction?
You go to conferences and it's the exact same questioning as it was, 20 years ago as to why, other than, the market definitely has moved. The baseline has definitely moved. I think people are starting to understand the idea of life cycle, sort of finance, in the sense of how they look at their math and getting past just that first capital cost being the only thing that to be looked at. And I think the business case of a life cycle financing approach has extended from what might have been 5 years up to maybe 20 years now. So it extends the, call it, viability of some of these things. But again, all those things generally, and then I would say there's a certain amount of, say, more on the institutional side, appreciation of the asset resiliency, if you want to call it, or sort of just better product and better security in that asset by being higher performing and better designed asset. But that all that math still largely relates to, again, I'd say the operational carbon piece. We still struggle in the sense that there is not a math that lets you recoup anything from anything that costs more for an embodied carbon.
Well, I guess part of my question is, does it cost more? So you talked a little bit about even the challenges of identifying what's low carbon and what's not low carbon, whether it's within one material like cement and concrete, or trying to compare across materials like concrete, steel, and wood, for example. What's been your on the ground experience with trying to source low carbon concrete or other low carbon materials?
Well, I'd say, so we've done many pilot projects with different suppliers on low carbon concrete and different things, and they've all come with, again, certain, whether it be a longer cure time or more costly additives you got to put in to mitigate that, or also, so they've all ended up coming with something that you could say are an added cost that again might not have been just the first line cost, but might have been time, might have been other things that sort of drive that. I know there's lots of innovation happen. I'm optimistic there's lots coming down the pipe, or is happening with concrete that is going to advance that. Then if you get into things like wood, for example, like, you know, you can't, a slab of wood is more expensive than a slab of concrete. Like, you can't compete. And so then if you're trying to make an argument around embodied carbon, again, there's no market there. And I know there's different ways as to how you look at the numbers, but is wood has a better embodied carbon, maybe, is there something there that gets through it? But our use of wood, for example, is something that we're looking at the embodied carbon, and it's a factor, but it's more a case that that's just more about prefab manufactured modular and getting up faster, in the approach there.
Finding cost savings in the construction process rather than in the materials.
In the process, yeah.
But what's, given, some of the challenges that you mentioned, in particular around, just getting good quality data and feeling confident that the decisions you're making are the right ones. Like, what advice actually maybe would you have for building material manufacturers that would make your job easier?
Well, I think, and we've touched on this before, but I do think there's sort of a need for call it the different major industry sort of partners to ideally come together on a bit of a universality of how things are looked at, as opposed to each putting forward their own kind of approach or standard in the sense of how you're determining the, whether it be the supply chain sourcing or the embodied carbon, outcome of that type thing. So there's that. And then there is just, again, the more, we're now starting to hear language coming from, call it at the government level, and I'm sure you guys have been part of that, and that is starting to talk about embodied carbon, right? And that's important, and that's what we want to look at. And so the more that becomes criteria, and whether that criteria be criteria relative to bidding on something or relative to permit or whatever, then all the more the data has to sort of get crystallized or clarified in the sense of, okay, what is that we're using to judge that with? But I would say right now, there isn't anything at the moment other than say in our case, our own math internally, others that I would say, I shouldn't say there isn't anything, but there's, without going through a lot of effort to sort of be third party verified, there's not really a clearinghouse, if you want to call it, that sort of says, like, similar to sort of LEED on different elements of, say, operating carbon, just to sort of validate. And I know LEED is starting to build in as well, so I should be, but that sort of validates, third party authenticates, isn't too painful to do, to sort of say, okay, yeah, your embodied carbon is X. But again, it's also in the sense that no one's asking for it yet.
We talked, you're sort of talking about strategies to reduce the carbon of building materials, but we released, the cement and concrete industry released a roadmap to net zero a number of years ago now. And one of the things that we found in our modeling is that you can find very significant reductions just through material efficiency, right? That we over design not just buildings, but of all of our infrastructure, both in terms of the cement intensity, for example, of the mixes that we use on our projects, but also just the volume of concrete that we use on our projects. How has that material efficiency thinking or challenge been integrated into your design process?
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much we can, because again, our building systems are largely sort of permitted on liability protection than they are, innovation and advancing forward. So often a lot of the over-design thing is a function of a building code that's asking for things that, it doesn't really have room to sort of say, hey, can we push the bar here or try this or do that? We are always striving, in the sense of looking for material efficiency and how we're doing that. That's why, we're big believers, whether it be concrete, steel, or wood, in the idea of more modular, prefab, that type of thing, because I think that also drives a certain amount of material efficiency in taking that approach all the way through to your down your supply chain. But so as I say, it's something we think about, but often it's something that we're controlled or limited by, you know, the other external parties, you know, whether it be municipal government or whatever, that is um, assessing, you know, whether it's okay or not in how we're moving with things. And again, it just comes down to um, there is no path for innovation in many of these processes to say, hey, yeah, how can I design something that, you know, needs, you know, we know we can design it, but how can we satisfy external parties if we're going to put in, say, you know, 10% less concrete or 10% less structure in what we're doing here. So yeah, that's that's unfortunately the only answer I have is what we can get away with, but largely still in a world of people looking for lowest liability than anything.
So we like to say that we're obviously trying to push for some of those innovations in the codes and standards process, but I guess the way of sort of summing up what it means moving from a prescriptive approach to a more performance based
Yes.
perspective
Yes.
on codes and standards.
Yes.
You've done a fair number of impressive projects. We mentioned a couple of them already on the podcast. LEED Platinum certifications, net zero district energy systems, not to mention the significant efforts that we touched on around, innovative financing mechanisms, trying to accelerate the flow of capital into these types of projects. Is there one kind of project or initiative that you've been a part of that really stands out for you that you're particularly proud of?
Probably every project has one thing on it that we sort of like push the envelope on a little bit. Whenever I go buy a building or whatever, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the one with the puzzle parking, or that's the one with the, thermal. So there's an element. I would say that there's two that really bring it all together is, Dockside and Zibby getting to that scale where you're really able to play, like when you can play on the horizontal infrastructure planning and sort of the utility side of things that's going to drive your energy source. That gives you a huge leg up to just be able to move so much more forward, right? And then also when you're planning, sort of at scale, larger community scale, then again, there's just so much more you can bring into it as it relates to, say, the One Planet Living framework and all the different sort of partners and elements and things that you can put together. So I would say, the most fun, and I say the fun is getting the vision and the narrative and getting everything locked down. Once you get into construction, it's always chaos and a headache, no matter what project you're on. But the most fun was just that sort of chaos of getting all that together and into sort of one pretty bold vision. Getting alignment around that. Getting all the different sort of voices at the table to sort of enable that to sort of continue to run now, which will be another 10, 15 years before that's sort of really, I'd say humming, but it's, it's got the district energy, it's got the building performance card, it's got all the transportation and indigenous community, all those sort of things all come together. So
I think that's been from an external vantage point here in Ottawa, watching the Zibi development unfold, just the sheer complexity of the partnerships that were required to get a project like that up and running. You've got two provinces, two municipalities, the National Capital Commission, Indigenous interests. I mean, it's super, super complicated. So yeah, amazing achievement to get all of that pulled together.
That site was owned by Domtar. It was a contaminated site. It was of interest, sacred interest of Indigenous, all that kind of stuff. So they knew they just couldn't put a for sale sign up on that. They needed to work with someone that could put a bold vision there. So I would say, the leading with, when we put together a One Planet Living action plan that was derived to, our first public meeting was actually just putting the 10 principles of One Planet Living out to have people write down what's important to them and what that community would be, which became the action plan, before we'd even really done any massing or anything like that. But it was leading with a very bold sustainability story there that was able to get alignment. If it was just, we're going to go build 4 million square feet, then like we'd probably still be fighting, trying to go through and get approval. So we had, as you mentioned, the two provinces, the two cities, the federal government, they all signed off on saying, all right, as long as everything that's going to get designed and planned matches the outcomes we're seeking with this One Planet Living action plan, we're on board. right? And that's what drove the whole process from there.
Yeah, really, really quite amazing. And as a resident of Ottawa, I'm super excited about, watching that development continue to evolve and deliver on some of those metrics that you've been talking about. I wonder though, like in the context of the market today, obviously affordable housing is top of mind for governments across the country. We're in a huge housing slump. Ontario housing market is down, I think 20% or something like that. Housing costs remain out of reach for many Canadians, despite the fact that we're seeing some relief on interest rates, et cetera. Where do you see all of that heading? Do you see sustainable design playing a positive role in addressing that challenge? Do you see that, affordability is going to be, put a bit of a dampening effect or chill effect on the sustainability conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say everything from, the signaling from our neighbors saying that climate change is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind, through to where we sit here. And sustainability is definitely taking a bit of a backbench. The housing market, as we all is challenged right now with no clear fix. It's largely a cost issue. We know the demand's there, but it's sort of a cost escalation that we saw happen sort of through COVID from supply chain mashup and all that. That's just never, sort of really come down. And that's sort of driving, this sort of affordability element in the sense that, there's no shortage of buildings approved and ready to get into construction, but there's just not a market that can pay for it at the cost it's being constructed at today, generally. So yeah, it's the first time, I've been running Windmill for sort of 22, 20. This first time I'm sort of like, I'm really not sure what's going to get out of this, us out of this right now, in the sense of fixing our what is primarily cost issue in a strong demand market where there's just supply that should be doubling what it was is going down substantially, and the government signals, again, unfortunately, has been headlines that has not translated into anything on the ground that's really making a meaningful difference there right now.
So it's back to the sort of carrots and sticks conversation a little bit.
Yeah, and that we're seeing, like, because affordability is taking center stage, and so I've as you have many times had audiences up on Parliament and speaking to ministers, sort of always have perplexed in the sense we have a climate policy, we have an affordability housing problem, and tools and grants. There is far more demand for that, call it affordability or housing financing out there than there is available. And so there's absolutely no reason why you can't be tying to that the stick of meeting certain, higher sustainability bar if you want to secure, what is favorable financing or favorable grants. But if anything, it's gone the opposite, where say with CMHC, for example, with the financing available for apartment construction, they've watered down their sustainability requirements. They've upped other areas like accessibility, not that that's not important, all those sort of things, but there really doesn't seem to be a strong alignment as there could be in sort of saying, okay, if we want to meet our climate policies and our housing policies, let's intertwine these things in such a way that we really get the best out of both in doing that. And so that's continued to frustrate me. And now even with what's coming up with Build Canada Homes and other things, again, you're seeing statements that aren't necessarily translating down to how things are, be it the metrics of selection or how things are moving forward.
Jonathan, thank you so much for giving us your time today. Super fun conversation, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us on our podcast.
Great to be here. Love the work you guys are doing and continuing to do, and look forward to our zero carbon concrete arriving at our site sometime soon.
We're going to get there.
Thank you to our audience for listening. And don't forget to subscribe and follow our podcast on your favorite platform. We hope to see you next time.